What up, Wizards? It's Dev, as usual, and today we're going to talk about some Magic the Gathering decks, as usual. But we're not going to talk about the usual decks, not on this channel, no. Here's 3 off-meta decks you can win on the ladder with right now.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck techs. I come correct like a porn star, slicing up all these other suckers with my sword mark.
And we're back with special guest Igby to talk a little Standard, and I know it's getting stale out there. We've still got like 3+ months of Standard left before the new set comes out, and that's going to be exciting. We get to go back to Dominaria for a new Standard set. Rotation happens, so a lot is going to happen in Standard. And all eyes are going to be on that format a couple of months from now. But for right now, if you're still in the arena, slogging away every day on the ladder, and you want some wins with a deck that you haven't played in a good long time, it's kind of tough out there. All the Esper lists and the blue-red based control decks out there are getting just as eye-rolling to play against as like Rogues once was, and even decks that were kind of new not too long ago, like Boros Aggro, feel super repetitive to play against now. And then of course you got your Mono White Aggro and your Grixis Vampires, which have somehow become stale to play against. Grixis Vampires is too well represented in the format to be cool anymore at this point. I mean, you just run up against the same few decks over and over, and it's really starting to get a little boring out there in Standard, if I say so myself, and I'm the guy that really likes Standard. But like I like to do every season or so, sometimes I skip one, but I felt like now was a good time to do this video. We're going to talk about 3 off-meta decks that have been doing somewhat well in tournament results here or there and provide a bright ray of janky hope out there in the Standard wilderness. So remember to like the video. I put work into YouTube videos. I know it doesn't seem like it, but I totally do. So help me out there, and if you want to, just also sub to the channel. Subs have been dipping this month. You gotta help me out there. Probably because I've been sick and stuff. Haven't been making as many videos. Sorry about that. But this one should be a banger. So let's go ahead and talk about the first deck that we want to talk about today. And that is a Boros deck. But it's not the Boros Aggro deck like you might think. Although, I think some people at this point have stopped playing Standard for long enough that they're not even aware Boros Aggro is a real deck. It has been for a while now. That said, if you are sick of the Boros Aggro deck, there's another deck that you may have heard of. That's kind of why this is the first deck we're going to cover today, because I think this is the one that you're most likely to have heard of, but I also want to give a full-throated endorsement of this deck today because it's easily my favorite deck of the 3 we'll talk about in this video. So let's take a second to discuss Boros Reanimator. Thanks, Couch Dev. It's Laboratory Dev here with the chicken to talk a little bit about this Boros Reanimator deck. And I love that Boros gets a Reanimator pile. Not long ago, in one of those reprints I want videos, I talked about how I wanted White to start getting good reanimation spells again because it used to have that as part of the color pie. And then, just a set or two later, we got Invoke Justice. It is a 5 mana with 5 different white pips in it. Reanimation spell. Usually, your reanimation spell has to be very good to be playable at 5 mana. But right now, most of the other decent reanimation spells in Standard are also 5 mana. So there's that. There is one that can be foretold and then played at 4 mana, but a lot of the time, it's not worth it to take your turn 2 and your turn 4 to do that. You need to dump something in the yard on turn 2 or turn 1, right? So a lot of times you don't want your reanimation spell to take 2 turns. Invoke Justice might cost 5 mana, but it also puts a bunch of counters on stuff, which is good in this deck for a number of reasons. Our reanimation targets are Velomachus Lorehold and Sanctuary Warden. This is really cool because with Sanctuary Warden, you can make a 9/9 Warden with your Invoke Justice. And then take a counter off of it, a +1/+1 counter when it attacks. Or maybe take the first shield counter off when it comes into play. And then when it attacks, you start taking +1/+1 counters off of it so you can draw more cards. Basically, Invoke Justice puts enough counters on this that allows you to draw a lot of cards turn over turn. And that's really important for getting card advantage in what is ostensibly a Reanimator deck, but is also kind of a control deck. So it plays a ton of spells, a lot of defense in our Reanimator deck. Now, Velomachus Lorehold can hit a number of really cool things. It can hit, because it gets counters on it with Invoke Justice, it can hit an Emeria's Call. And if you Velomachus Lorehold, swing in with Vigilance, which means that you're immune to opposing Wandering Emperors, really good thing about Velomachus, but if you swing in with Velomachus and it has some counters on it, hit an Emeria's Call, and suddenly you got a 5/5 Vigilance, flying, sitting there ready to block, and 2 4/4 Angels, so you're forcing a sweeper on the opponent. Conversely, if you need a sweeper, you might hit a Burn Down the House. Right? Well, that's not going to kill your Velomachus because you put enough counters on it with Invoke Justice to withstand a burn down the house. So That's a pretty cool little facet of the deck too. And of course, Burn Down the House can also be used to just create aggro dudes too when you need that. However, in the meantime, in case you don't get the perfect turn 4 reanimate this guy, which the deck can do, you've got Seize the Spoils on turn 3, as well as Fable of the Mirror Breaker on turn 3. These both create treasures in their way. Seize the Spoils, guaranteed treasure. Fable of the Mirror Breaker, incredible card, not guaranteed treasure, but still, you get it enough of the time that you can invoke Justice on 4 after a turn 2 Thrilling Discovery. Or maybe turn 3, Seize the Spoils, drop an important reanimation target in there, get your treasure, turn 4, invoke Justice, hit your Velomachus or whatever. In case that doesn't happen, the deck can still go pretty long, right? Eventually it'll start being able to just play its Sanctuary Wardens, play its Velomachus, play its Myria's Calls off the top, so it's got all these ridiculous haymakers in the late game, which is relatively common to a lot of standard decks right now. And if your opponent does have removal for your stuff, so long as it's not exile-based removal, you just get to invoke Justice it whenever you draw those. So in the late game, you've got this ridiculous, ability to stay in the game and just play like crazy, left and right hooks over and over, uppercuts, right? But to get there, you have to have ways to bridge the gap. You have to have ways to, in the early game, withstand. And we've got a few of those, right? We got Fateful Absence. Use this sparingly when need be, but if you have to use it early to stop the bleeding, as we'd say, do that. Same thing with Dragon's Fire. This can take out 5/5s if you have a Velomachus Lorehold in your hand, but even if you have to, take out a 3-toughness creature because you don't have a Velomachus, it's still good enough a lot of the time, but it's good early game protection. There's also the fact that Thrilling Discovery and Wandering Emperor gain you some life. Even Angel Fire Ignition, there's only one copy of this card. If Velomachus hits it, it's really, really good. So there's that, but it's also just kind of fine to play on like a Fable of the Mirror Breaker's 2/2 Goblin token and get in for, 4 damage, indestructible, vigilance, guaranteed to make the token, lifelink, right? So just a really sweet little card this can be, and if we play it on one of our early creatures, then we have it to flash back later, with the Velomachus in play or something. So just a sick little card, but we don't have to play too many copies of Angel Fire Ignition. The deck can stand one, but that's another way of gaining life, is with the lifelink on this. Wandering Emperor gains life with its -2 ability and also can be a removal spell. So there's only like 7 real removal spells, 8, 9 if you count the Burn Down the House in the deck, so that's not a bad number of removal spells. We've got a sweeper in the deck. Wandering Emperor helps turn the corner while also putting a little bit of pressure on the opponent. It's something the opponent has to usually spend multiple cards to deal with. While they're doing that, we hit Invoke Justice, we hit Sanctuary Warden, which takes multiple cards to completely deal with a lot of the time, and also draws us cards. So we're kind of snowballing a little bit of card advantage here, we're sometimes getting the God Hand and invoking Justice on 4, and then sometimes we're like, Thrilling Discovery into Dragon's Fire on 3, turn 4, Wandering Emperor, take out your other guy, and then start kind of slow rolling, casting Sanctuary Wardens, getting to the Burn Down the House with the Thrilling Discoveries and the Fable of the Mirror Breaker, making sure that we draw the important cards, hitting that sweeper, and then turning the corner by just casting our Sanctuary Wardens. So the deck has a number of good game plans to execute, and they tend to work pretty well almost no matter what kind of matchup you're in. The deck has a lot of game in a number of important matchups in this format. This is just a really well-rounded deck right now that looks like a pretty straightforward Reanimator deck, but actually has a lot more going for it than that. Overall, I know I've already said this, but it bears repeating. This is my favorite deck we'll talk about today. I have a lot of faith in this pile because I played a lot of games with it, and not only it, but a Naya Reanimator deck I've had a lot of fun with. Video of that on the channel, as a matter of fact. That deck seemed really, really fun, and actually very, very powerful too. So if you're not going to try the Boros one, try the Naya one out. But the Boros one is streamlined very well. Velomachus Lorehold is an incredible reanimation target, and hitting an Angel Fire Ignition or something just makes you feel godlike. So try this deck out. It's way more resilient than you might think. It has more card advantage than a Boros deck has any right to have. The milkshakes are incredible. When it comes to bringing your boys to the yard, you've got Thrilling Discovery, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which is one of the best cards in Standard already. Just incredible little mid-range deck here that can go long. Honestly, I think that kind of describes all of the decks that we'll look at today, right? Nice little mid-range deck that can go long, and that especially describes this second deck, which I actually think is one that you're less likely to have heard of in this format, at least, than a deck like Boros Reanimator, but is also even more competitively viable, especially in a format like Best of 3, than Boris Reanimator is. Let's take a quick look at Teamer Midrange. Now, this Teamer deck is kind of a weird one, but when you really get past the weirdness, it's just kind of a traditional blue-red deck like we've seen before. So why is that exciting? Well, even though you've got your Hullbreaker Horror, your Goldspan Dragons, right? You've got your Memory Deluge, your Fading Hope, your Dwari Disruption, right? Like your Dragon's Fire, Expressive Iteration especially. Like these are all cards that we associate heavily with the Izzet decks in the format right now. But there's some interesting tech here. This deck, first of all, plays Reckoner Bankbuster, which is not something you see every day, but there's far more creatures in this deck than there are the average Izzet deck. So you got more things to accrue it. Right, this is a 3-color deck, so it's a little bit better to play this like 2-drop, doesn't care what mana you have out, you know. And it's another threat. That's one thing the Izzet decks don't have, is a lot of threats, and this is a threat that creates card advantage. That is what this deck is most interested in. If we're going to play threats, we want them to create card advantage. So Briarbridge Tracker is in the deck, creates card advantage. Swings Vigilance, again, good against Wandering Emperor, so that's nice. You know, you've got your Titan of Industry in here, which is the other green card they've added to the deck. I'm going to say this a couple times in this video, very likely. There's a reason the Titan of Industry keeps getting added to the top end of decks that can afford it. And a deck that plays like Goldspan Dragon, for instance, and Fable of the Mirror Breaker to make treasure and stuff like that, this deck can afford a Titan of Industry. It was already playing Hullbreaker Horror. And again, I'm going to say this a couple of times in this video, very likely. Titan of Industry right now, in this environment, has proven to kind of be the better creature than something like Hullbreaker Horror, especially in a deck like this. That isn't a traditional Izzet deck all the way down. It plays far more creatures and threats and stuff, fewer spells, so a card like Hullbreaker Horror just isn't going to be as good. But a card like Titan of Industry is going to be really good at ending the game, especially when the opponent has already used removal on your Fable of the Mirror Breaker, must-kill creature, your Briarbridge Tracker, probably should kill creature. Goldspan Dragon must kill creatures. So by the time Titan of Industry comes down, especially if it gets a shield counter, it's probably there to stay. You've also got Galazeth Prismari in the deck for a couple of reasons, right? It makes a treasure token. You can, of course, actually cast stuff with treasure tokens without having to sack them if you have a Galazeth, which is nice. Because, again, you've got Goldspan, you've got Fable of the Mirror Breaker in the deck, you've got Briarbridge Tracker to make little token artifacts in the form of clues, and all of those can be tapped for mana. You know, Reckoner Bankbuster can be tapped for mana with a Galazeth Prismari. This will help you cast, you know, your Memory Deluges. It'll help you cast things like Goldspan and Titan of Industry and stuff, and yet still have mana on the table to cast Dwari Disruption or make disappear or negate to counter a spell that targets the Titan, right? Just a neat deck here that kind of combines some of the things that we've seen in the Izzet deck, undeniably, right, with some of the things that we see from these like big go over the top mid-range decks in the format, right? Like Jund and you know, the decks that play green and whatnot that'll just throw in Titan of Industry, you know. And again, I really like the inclusion of a thing like Briarbridge Tracker. The synergy with Galazeth Prismari is kind of interesting, you know. The fact that it's another threat that creates card advantage. Again, if the Izzet deck's going to play threats, they might as well create card advantage. It does that. It's got Vigilance, so it's good against Emperor, you know. There's just a million reasons to play this card that are all like really niche. They're all like 2% reasons, but it all adds up to like 10%. There's definitely a reason to play Tracker. Just a really neat addition to this build, aside from just the Titan, that makes it very spicy. And the Galazeth, too, for that matter. You just don't see this card every day anymore, but awesome in this deck. Plus, another thing about Briarbridge that I haven't brought up yet is you can copy it with a Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which is neat. Also, Reckoner Bankbuster, you turn this into a creature, you can copy it with Fable of the Mirror Breaker and then use the copy to draw a card or attack or whatever. So, a lot of cool reasons to play Fable of the Mirror Breaker in this deck, too, that you don't normally see, but one of the biggest ones is to copy Goldspan Dragon and Titan of Industry and Hullbreaker Horror, so a lot of good reasons to play Fable in this deck, just like every deck that plays Fable. There's a reason it's one of the best cards in the format. I just like this thing for being an Izzet pal that thought way outside the box. And I know it's not super outside the box to think, well, what if I played creatures in my Izzet deck? But to say, well, what if I added a color? What if I played Titan of Industry in my Izzet deck? And what if I added specifically Briarbridge Tracker, Reckoner Bankbuster, and Galazeth Prismari to the deck to all kind of synergize with one another? A couple of them are really good Fable like copy targets. So just again, I think that the reasons for adding these green cards to the deck are in some ways like more plentiful than it seems at first glance. There's a lot of really cool synergy going on here that might not pop out at you when you first look at the deck, but it's there. Altogether, this is a deck that does is-it stuff while also kind of doing like big, stupid green creature stuff. It's always something I'm going to like. Just a neat little deck here that if you're going to play is-it and get to the 7 mana for Hullbreaker Horror or whatever, you might as well play Teamer and get to the 7 mana for Titan of Industry, which is arguably the better card right now. Now, we're going to look at one more deck today, and this is probably, in terms of like competitive results that we've seen so far from the deck, the least viable competitively of these decks, but it is a really, really janky thing for those who just want to jank and nothing else, right? The Boris Reanimator deck is almost too visible at this point, too well known for people to be like, yeah, that's a cool janky pile I want to play. It's almost too mainstream, right? The Teamer deck, I can see some of you who watch this video just being like, well, that's just an is-it deck with green cards. That's not cool enough. But this next deck, if you want jank, this one's got the jank. Let's take a look at 5-color enchantments, 5-color control, 5-color mid-range, 5-color good stuff. Now, this one is wacky, folks. I had to make myself way smaller so you could actually see all the cards on the screen for this one, but even though it's kind of tough to tell exactly what's going on in this deck, this is kind of a Kami War deck. It's a take on a deck that Croaky's, fairly famous at this point, Twitch streamer that plays Magic the Gathering, he was building this deck towards the beginning of the format, and he's kind of given up on it at this point to move on to weirder stuff, but at the same time, a lot of people have taken up the mantle of this deck and tried to make it something beyond what it was at the beginning of the format. And this is definitely the weirdest build you'll see. This build recently went 3-2 at a relatively well-stocked event in terms of like the number of players that were at the thing. So I was a little surprised by the in-the-money finish, right? In the positive finish of a deck that looks like this, because there are a ton of 1-ofs in this thing, and it might look a little random to you. But this is the kind of deck where all the 1-ofs look like a result of careful play with the deck. How many Kami Wars can you actually play? Probably not actually that many, so there's only a couple in the deck, right? How many Storm the Festival can you actually play? Probably not that many, so there's only 1 in the deck. How many Titan of Industry can you play? A lot of decks play 3 or 4. This deck's only on 2 copies. So this deck has really used its slots in really interesting ways, and one of those interesting ways is in search of greatness. Note how many, different spots on the curve this deck plays. Look at all these 5-drops, right? Look at the fact that the deck plays 2 6-drops and 2 7-drop permanents. So there's that. So, you've got Wandering Emperor, you got Binding the Old Gods as 4-drops. So this deck could theoretically go turn 2 in Search of Greatness, turn 3, say, Fight Rigging, or Kaito Shizuki, or Fable of the Mirror Breaker, or something like that. And then the next turn, Kaito's actually a really good call there because it's going to phase out, meaning that it's basically guaranteed to be in play on turn 4 when In Search of Greatness procs during your upkeep. And then off of, say, that Kaito, you could play a free Wandering Emperor, a free Binding the Old Gods. How's that sound, right? And the next turn, because your opponent's very not super likely to take out your Binding the Old Gods, then you get a free Wrenn and 7 or a Battle of Frost and Fire. Then after that, you get a free Kami War. And then after that, you get a free Titan of Industry. This will very likely not happen, but the deck plays so many different spots on the curve and so many important permanents at those spots on the curve that it's kind of the deck for In Search of Greatness. And it's also worth noting that this scries for important pieces that you might need at any given time. I need removal, scry for my Meat Hook, scry for my Battle of Frost and Fire, scry for a Binding, scry for an Unleash, right? But I need a big permanent, scry away those lands and try to get a Titan. But In Search of Greatness is not the only way to get free stuff that the deck plays. We also play 2 Fight Rigging, which I just mentioned, but this is another interesting permanent on turn 3, especially if you're not playing against an aggro deck, I imagine. If you're on the draw, you go turn 2 In Search of Greatness, turn 3 Fight Rigging, you're probably dead. But there's some matchups where you can pull that off and get free cards off of In Search of Greatness. Like, imagine a world where because you have a Fight Rigging, on the next turn you get a free Binding the Old Gods. On the next turn, you get a free Wrenn and 7, and that makes a big enough creature to where Fight Rigging can actually go off and get you another free spell. So there are kind of god lines, god hands with this deck that you can get multiple free spells in a game while still casting spells. Like, but imagine, a turn where you go fight rigging on 3, and because you did that, In Search of Greatness gives you a free Binding the Old Gods, and you get to hold up the Wandering Emperor. Like, there's some really powerful lines in this deck, but even if you don't hit these In Search of Greatness or fight rigging lines, you still got Wrenn and 7. You've still got Lolth, Spider Queen. You've got Battle of Frost and Fire, Binding the Old Gods, right? You've got Kami War, Storm the Festival, Titan of Industry. These are all things that, although they're expensive, are all like massive bombs in the late game. You get to that point in the game, and suddenly you can do something very, very good, like no matter what, right? And things like Big Score will help you get there. This will make the Treasure to help fix your mana. It'll also help you get rid of like bad cards, basically. Things that don't work or you don't have the mana for, they're not good for the matchup. Try to draw into some good stuff. Binding the Old Gods, Unleash the Inferno, Wandering Emperor, all very good for mana removal, obviously. You get to play cool one-ofs like Serolf Realm Eater, right? You get incredible, again, removal like Riveter's Charm that can also draw a bunch of cards. Celestis, incredible ramp that gains you a little bit of life and also helps you churn through cards to help get the stuff you need. Another deck with Fable of the Mirror Breaker. I apologize for that. But obviously, we're playing Titan of Industry in this deck. We're playing Kami War in this deck, which is not legendary, by the way. So once you get to Okagachi Made Manifest, you can copy that with Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which is just unbelievable. You've got Courier's Briefcase in here to draw 3 cards eventually. You'll almost certainly be able to do that. Couple of different sweepers, couple of defensive cards. Powerful planeswalkers like Wandering Emperor and Kaito Shizuki. You've got creatures that create interesting bits of advantage, like Serolf creates some advantage for you. Evelyn very obviously creates advantage for you. So even though there's not a ton of creatures, Titan of Industry very obviously creates advantage. So even though there's not a ton of creatures in the deck, the ones that we do play are creatures that are hard to deal with just one card. So just a really cool little deck here. And even though there's a ton of fun-ofs, they're probably more silver bullets than they are just, one-ofs that this player thought would be cool to put into the deck. But as far as the sideboard goes, there's some interesting stuff in here. Duress against the control decks in the format, Ray of Enfeeblement when you come against Mono White and Boros, Make Disappear when you need another counterspell, and especially when you're going to be on the play-in game too. Go Blank against, again, the more control-y or is-it piles in the format. Negates, you have another counterspell. Reckoner Bankbuster, just a good thing to have in these mid-range matchups. Serolf Realm Eater, another one for these aggro matchups. Riveter's Charm, another one for probably not just aggro matchups, but decks that rely on like 1 or 2 big creature drops, Leer Disciple of the Drowned, stuff like that. And even like the odd green-white, Selesnya, Illuminator Virtuoso decks, stuff like that. Sorin the Mirthless, just a decent planeswalker for the mid-range matchups. More Unleash the Inferno, more Lolth, more Workshop, just one Workshop Warchief down here, mostly against aggro, I would imagine. And that's the deck, just kind of a good stuff 5-color mid-range pile that was originally a very dedicated enchantments deck to get us to the Kami War. Sometimes you'd see Hallowed Haunting in here, but as the season has gone on, it's interesting to see how this deck has shifted. It's trying wilder and wilder stuff. It's getting away from the enchantments conceit, and it's realizing that if I'm going to pay 6 mana for the Kami War and I'm going to play all 5 colors, I might as well just play the best cards in the format. And as you can see, that's what this player has more or less done. It's all about finding the right configuration of the best cards in the format. As we've said, the deck also grinds super well, like better than you would expect. And hey, if you want another reason to watch that Naya Reanimator video, check that video out again, because at the end, you get to see the 5-color enchantments deck in action. And it's actually one of the best games we've ever played on stream in like the 2 years we've been streaming. So again, check that link in the description. If you haven't watched that video, watch that video. It's really cool not only to see the Naya Reanimator deck, but to see this deck full on in action and getting to do really cool stuff. And lastly, I want to stress that the version of the deck that I've shown you today is not necessarily the only version of the deck. More than the other 2 decks that we've looked at, this is easily the most flexible one. A lot of the versions that I've seen don't even play cards like In Search of Greatness, or a lot of the one-ofs that we saw in this version of the deck. This is a very flexible thing that if you want to make your own, there's plenty of ways to do that. But that's all I got for this one, y'all. Let me know how you felt about it down there in the comments section, and if there's any decks that you think I should have covered for this video that I didn't, then let me know down there. If you have like a pet deck on Arena that's winning all the games on ladder and nobody knows about it, tell us your secrets down there. And of course, check out some videos. You can check out that Nia Reanimator video if you want to. I won't shut up about it, will I? Or you can check out these various other videos about how to make a mana base in Standard right now. That's important if you want to build this 5-color deck, right? So we got a lot of stuff on the channel. If you haven't been to the channel in a while, check some of these videos out. They're good. I'm doing good work nowadays, guys. Aside from that, give me a subscribe if you haven't done it yet. And of course, smash the like button. I think that's what YouTubers are supposed to say. Is that like a little 3-4 years ago at this point? I don't know what you're supposed to say now. Just hit the thumbs up. Are we back to that? Let's see. I don't know what the YouTube meta is now. I've been sick for too long. But just do the YouTube stuff. Do all that. Do all the things. And also, if you want to watch me on Twitch, link in the description for that. You want to hook up to the Patreon, throw me $1 a month so you can vote on what content we do. That's why I'm doing this video. So, hey, support the channel like a lot, and you get to vote. It's a decent deal. Check out the link in the description or go to patreon.com/SBMTG. I would really appreciate your support. But aside from that, what I'd really appreciate for real is if you just stay on the channel and watch some more of my stuff. Apparently that's what YouTube wants now. So watch some more videos, please. You don't have to. It'd be cool if you did, though. But I guess I'm done for this one. So I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from the place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.
I'm sorting through some heinous haters like a pooper scooper. I'm just trying to take my life like a Koopa Trooper. I'm Double Mario, that mean I'm super. And I'm freaking dangerous like a Chupa Cabre. Got them all day like a Kanye, but I'm way better getting cheddar in Monterey. But Jack, you don't know, man. You got the show, man. You want roast beef? Well, I'm Arby.